Aloha, everyone. Welcome to Diversity Unlocks Innovation, celebrating Asia American Pacific Islander heritage for the month of May. And I have the distinct honor in being able to introduce our speaker for this month, Major General retired Suzanne Vares-Lum, who's also our president for the EastWest Center here at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. If you don't know me, my name is Gloria, and I am National Security Innovation Network University Program Director for UH Manoa, where our mission across the country with over 15 other university program directors, regional directors, and our regional network team, our mission is to being able to find, identify, and provide non-traditional problem solvers to solve national security problems within the DoD. And if you will allow me to present our speaker today, Susie, Ms. Suzanne Vares-Lum took office as president of the EastWest Center in January 2022. She is the first woman, Native Hawaiian, and Hawaii resident to be chosen for this role. Vares-Lum brings executive leadership and planning experience spanning the past several decades, culminating in 5 years serving with and advising the most senior officials at U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, where she cultivated and maintained key relationships with nations throughout the Indo-Pacific region. As a retired Major General with 34 years of service, Vares-Lum has held key roles addressing priority national security challenges in the region. After retirement, she formed Vares-Lum Indo-Pacific Consulting, LLC, to provide consulting and advising on regional issues. She is a seasoned keynote speaker and advocate on Indo-Pacific issues, leadership, and mentorship, and women, peace, and security. She led collaborative initiatives in the Pacific, including Hawaii, Guam, and the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands. As a community leader, Vares-Lum serves on a variety of nonprofit boards, including the American Red Cross Pacific Islands region, Pacific and Asian Affairs Council, and the Pacific International Center for High Technology Research. She has also served on committees that promote Hawaii's economic diversification, workforce development, and community dialogues on issues regarding land and water. She has also served as a strategic advisor to the Hawaii Chamber of Commerce Military Affairs Council and is an active member of the U.S.-Japan Council. She received her Bachelor's of Arts degree in journalism in 1989 and her Master of Education in Teaching in 1996 from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. As a graduate of the U.S. Army War College, she earned a Master of Strategic Studies degree in 2011. In 2019, she became a National Security Fellow of the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. She is also an alumna of the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies. Vares-Lum received the Ellis Island Medal of Honor in 2017. Additionally, the State of Hawaii House of Representatives, Governor of the State of Hawaii, and Hawaii Congressional Delegation presented her with certificates of recognition for outstanding service to the State of Hawaii in 2021. Ms. Vares-Lum is a resident of Kaneohe, Hawaii, and is married with 2 daughters, Diana and Connie. And without further ado, I will hand the floor to you, Susie.
Thank you, Gloria, and aloha mai kako, which for some of you, like Gloria, might know that is a warm greeting of aloha to or care to all of you. No matter where you are. And it's really an honor to speak to the National Security Innovation Network. Thank you for everything that you do to secure our nation. I'm just honored to be here with, it looks like 25 of you during your lunch hour, spending some time with me and your colleagues. You know, it is very gracious of you, Gloria, to read the whole bio, but the fact is I hope that this time can be a talk story, we call it in Hawaii time, where I share a little bit about myself, but I really want to open up to questions and answers. You know, Behind me, you see a picture, this virtual image, and it seems to be popular these days, but often people think, no, this is not my backyard, nor is that my house. Actually, it is a wonderful structure designed by I.M. Pei in 1960. I.M. Pei is a famous architect when we talk about Asian Americans who had an influence on architecture, not just in Hawaii. Yes, David, he is famous for the annex to the Louvre, which is that glass pyramid, which of course was controversial, but an icon now. Also, the China Bank in Hong Kong. Yes, so he's had some significant um, um, designs. So this Japanese garden was part of the design, which the Emperor of Japan has also planted. The Dalai Lama has been here, heads of state, a lot of key leaders coming here to Hawaii to really have dialogues on key critical issues. And right next to us, let's see, it's that way. If you can't see it, is a Hale Manoa. Hale means house, and Manoa is the area that Gloria and I are in right now, which is an area, of those of you who've been to Hawaii on the university campus. Beautiful, lush and green. Hale Manoa was also designed by I.M. Pei, and it was designed to bring people together from this region. You know, coming out of the ashes of World War II, all of you know, because you are intelligence professionals, you know that Hawaii in 1941, December 7th, early that morning, was the site, of course, of our entrance into the war, the bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Empire of Japan. Coming out of the ashes of World War II and into a Cold War, then Senator Lyndon Johnson, who became, of course, our president, as well as other congressional leaders like Senator Daniel K. Inouye, Hawaii's own, felt that as veterans, and Governor Burns, who was also a World War II veteran, really believed there needed to be a place that we could promote people-to-people understanding and nation-to-nation understanding for dialogue, research, and cooperative learning. So thus was born the EastWest Center, so that East and West could understand one another more. So it's events like this, Gloria, that is in the spirit of the EastWest Center, that the more that we understand one another, the more that we understand culture and where we're coming from and perspectives, maybe we can prevent things. Now, if you remember, I throw out this example often. If Admiral Yamamoto, before he knew the plans to surprise attack on Pearl Harbor and Oahu, actually, not just Pearl Harbor, the whole island, he had been educated in the United States, so he understood that, his famous line, "You're awakening the sleeping giant," was from the idea that Americas would fight and defend their interests. So, but many leaders in Japan did not understand that, and nor did, if you remember, you've seen Tora, you look at the G2, those of your intel, you always feel like no one ever listens to intel, because I'm an intel officer by training as well. So he's trying to convince everyone, no, Japan is capable and they were going to do it. But this lack of understanding, underestimation, led to miscalculation on both sides, thus entrance into the amazing war on two fronts, or multiple fronts. So the EastWest Center on that legacy continues today. That last year, 2 weeks ago, President Eisenhower, 62 years ago, signed into the authorization law the establishment of the EastWest Center. And it's because of those reasons. So that was a long entrance into why I think this is important today. But a little bit about myself. I was born and raised here in Wahiawa. Some of you on the line who've been to Hawaii know where that is. Gloria, I'm sure, and Mike know where that is. I grew up with a mother from Japan. My dad was from Maui, and he was stationed in Japan and met my mom. But my dad is of Native Hawaiian, Tahitian, Chinese, Portuguese, and English ancestry. And his first time leaving Maui, where there wasn't even a stop sign, a stop light. He had stop signs on Maui, but no stop light. And went to Tokyo as his first duty station, you can imagine that, in 1960. And from there launched across the Pacific to do surveys on many of the Pacific islands. In fact, Stars and Stripes thought it was so intriguing that they did a 1961 article on him that I've kept. You know, he passed away last year, but I've kept it because recently I went to Palau for our Oceans Conference in this job. But being in that space and seeing what he would say when he came back, you know, because he spent so much time in the Pacific, particularly Micronesia, how he would share, you know, because they are the newest really immigrant here to Hawaii because of nuclear testing that happened in the 50s, environmental concerns, economic concerns. We have a large number of diaspora that comes to Hawaii, but he would always say, what people don't understand about Micronesia is what he saw, the amazing community that was built, that there were no orphans, no homeless, everyone shared everything they had, and we could learn much from that. So anyway, I know I digress, but that's the kind of experience that my dad brought with him when he left Maui and into his work in the Pacific as a surveyor. And by the way, they used to no GPS in the 60s. They used the stars to do mapping, early mapping in the Army Map Service. So that's an interesting piece. So, you know, growing up in Waihua, you know, my mom, thick Japanese accent, my dad, very thick pidgin English from Maui. So you can see that I call myself English as a second language speaker because I spoke exclusively pidgin English. So I consider myself bilingual, and it's not Japanese, it's pidgin English. So I tell people, well, you know, I had callous feet because I didn't wear shoes. You know, I ran around barefoot a lot, and certainly growing up, you would never have guessed that I would retire as a major general or be the president of EastWest Center if you watched me back then. I tell people I learned to speak standard English by, if you're around my age, Brady Bunch, Electric Company, and Sesame Street. So never say that TV is not good. It just depends on the kind of television you watch. So you know, growing up, seeing my father in the military, all of my uncles and great uncles who served during World War II, and hearing their stories, of course, kind of paved the way for me to be a graduate of the University of Hawaii ROTC program. And I was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Military Intelligence Corps, and I went to Germany, where there was an East and West Germany. Yes, I'm that old. Some of you might remember that, or maybe you've read it in your history books. Anyway, back then, they didn't allow women to be in combat arms units. So I was in the 3rd Infantry Division, the Audie Murphy Division, Rock of the Marne, which is now in Georgia, but back then was in West Germany. And I get my orders, and, you know, of course I want to go to intelligence unit. You know how it is. I was trained an intel officer. No, I went to a division artillery unit. You know what that means? That means that it was mostly male. There were very few female officers in that unit. But that was one of the few places they could put women intelligence officers as a fire support intelligence officer. So I end up in this unit. Of course, the only Asian American Pacific Islander in that unit. I walk into this large unit, and of course comes all of the stereotypes right from Hawaii. Oh, you must serve hula, and maybe you have Hawaiian time. You don't really do things on time, but you know, all of these things that came into play. So of course, when I walked in there, I felt myself having to make sure I worked hard towards overcoming those stereotypes by working harder, by working later. And many of you know that when you walk into a situation where maybe you are the minority in that group. But I went in there knowing and sharing about Hawaii. You know, it's Hawaii, we've produced a president of the United States, right? I mean, we didn't know that then, but a senator at that time. And, you know, Hawaii, I find myself sharing General Shinseki, who's from Kauai, a smaller island on the island chain, was the first Asian American chief of staff in the Army. Also, our late Senator Daniel K. Inouye, who became the highest ranking congressional leader before he passed away, 3rd in line to the presidency, who've made significant changes for our defense and security. He was part of a unit, if you remember, the 100th 442 Infantry, which to this date is the most highly decorated unit of its size in history, because these were Nisei World War II veterans who had to prove their loyalty to the United States. So I found myself sharing and justifying the whole time since I was young. But I found over time, I enjoy sharing. I enjoy sharing about the contributions of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders like you're doing today, because it is not ingrained in our history. I've also often in 34 years got asked questions on days like this is, well, why do we have that? We should have every ethnic group day. But you know, when you think about it, African American, Hispanic, women, Asian American, Pacific Islander is not really in our history books. And until that history and information is righted, I think moments like this to look and highlight different groups and diversity, diverse groups is important. You know, I want to say, I know I'm talking a lot here, that I think every time I've spoken about diversity, you know, we think about the inherent diversity of being born female, born Native Hawaiian, born in Hawaii. Those are the things that you're born with. But, you know, we often don't talk about the diversity that you acquire. That is the experiences that you have in culture and diversity, whether or not you are part of that. And I often think of, you know, one of the Pacific nations that sit within Oceania is New Zealand. You know, I've worked a lot with New Zealand, and I look at people, you know, I had a bilateral dialogue with a New Zealand brigadier, John Boswell, and he started off, he's of European descent, but he started off his whole opening in Maori. And all I could say was aloha kakahiaka, which means good morning, because he has embraced the place and culture and integrated it. If you worked with New Zealand Armed Forces, you know that it's well integrated. No matter where you come from, you become a part of that place. So, you know, when you think about diversity in experience and embracing, I think that is also a very powerful thing, and not just how you were born or how you grew up, but it is the acquisition of it, I think, that makes it even more powerful. So going back to, you know, after being a lieutenant, I came back home and I, you know, took positions where oftentimes I was the first female company commander in that particular MI unit in infantry. First female to be an S2 of the 29th Infantry Brigade when we deployed to Iraq. Because it was an infantry brigade, not till 2015 did they open up all combat positions to women in the US Armed Forces. So as long as you can do the job, you can be in the job. So, and then later on, I became the Chief of Staff of the Hawaii Army National Guard, and then was offered by a Marine 2-star to be a 1-star at the time Pacific Command in their J5 operations, plans and policy. And I was the first female to be in that position as well. And interestingly, some of the comments that were made before I took that job was, I don't know how Asian general officers are going to approach a female general officer engaging with them. And it's interesting, when some people put that self-doubt in your mind, you begin to doubt yourself, right? For a moment. But then I realized, as I was engaging, no one had a problem, because what they saw was American. They saw that flag, they saw what we represented, and actually it provided, I feel like being a female going into that actually disarmed some of the dialogue. And being a daughter of this region also disarmed that. Perhaps they felt that I understood a little bit about, you know, coming into the dialogue together, American and another country. And then later, I worked for Admiral Harry Harris, and he became the ambassador for the Republic of Korea. He was also the first Asian American to be the commander of Indo-Pacific Command, and still is to this day. But he certainly was an advocate, provided me with opportunities, and then I became the mobilization assistant to Admiral Davidson, who was the previous commander before the first one. So having just retired last year and then walking into this position, it's been wonderful because, you know, again, being the first female in this position, first Native Hawaiian, since 1960, I think I feel honored to be able to do that. And I hope this unlocks a series of different, of more diversity in years to come. You know, we know that we've seen the research that the more diversity there is on boards and organizations, that you have those different perspectives, those different insights are always helpful. But I gotta say that just having numbers and diversity, having events like this are great. But if you just have that alone and you don't have a culture that fosters that kind of diversity, it will be very challenging, because people will not have the feel comfortable to speak up that allows for the innovation that you need. You need an environment, a culture that allows for those different perspectives, no matter how different they are. And, you know, being a, right now, as we see the Pacific as a central piece to challenges, being from this place, I have been able to promote in our strategic planning this idea of the Pacific as the Pico, or the center. Pico is like your navel. And in Native Hawaiian culture, that is that place, you know, where things are birthed from. We see a emphasis with the agreement, with the U.S. agreement to Solomon Islands. We see concerns. We see, so my sharing as the new EastWest Center president with our leaders at the NSC as well as State Department is that the relationships that we have in the Pacific and the United States needs to go beyond just transactional. Because if we understand the Pacific and understand culture and this region, long-term relationships are what matters, to show that you actually care about people and culture. And I think even, I like this comment that Trish mentioned about many of the communities are matriarchal. Some are and some aren't, but in Palau, where we had our Oceans Conference, I was able to meet Secretary Kerry, Special Envoy of the President on Climate, and many Pacific Island nations. I also got to meet what they call the Bilum in Palau. She's like the queen, unofficial leader. And all of the women from the states within Palau, quite frankly, I didn't realize this until I went there. And she showed me the list of laws that were introduced by this unofficial body to the elected body. And these were not laws like Suzanne Vares-Lum month or anything like that. Today we declare it's Suzanne month. No, these were actual laws about prostitution, its impact, illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing, and consequences. They were social and economic bills that impacted the communities within Palau. And they were introduced by this unofficial body to the legislative body, and they all passed. Now, from a Western perspective, we might see that as, that is undue influence on a legislative body, okay? Or we might call it lobbyists in DC, anyway. But they don't have to lobby because they are, the beauty of it is that none of these laws were hurtful, but they were actually helpful to the community. So, you know, seeing it for Western eyes and understanding that, I think, is important. But those of us who understand that either through inherently being born here or acquired knowledge that some of us have about these areas in the Asia Pacific, I think makes us all more solid as leaders and innovators and promoting understanding so we can get to solutions, real solutions. So I know I've been talking for a while, so I do want to open it up to question and answers, making this more of a dialogue, but I do want to say that, you know, one last thing, if I could, is that the diversity is important, but how do we create unity and diversity? I believe it's through our values. That those values, that no matter where you come from, because Americanism, Franklin Roosevelt said, Americanism never has and never will be about race or ethnicity. It really is about a common set of values that we live by. And I think that's what can bind us. And if you've been in this organization, I'm sure it's pretty tight, just like in military organizations and units. After a while, you don't look at who's saving you, who's your buddy, what race they are, what gender they are. All you care about is that you're together on a mission. And if you breed that kind of culture, you're going to have incredible innovation. So with that, I turn it back over to you, Gloria, for questions and answers.
I love that, Susie. Thank you so much. I mean, and I think that's definitely, you know, bringing it back down to staying grounded, being able to bring back the values, or just enhancing the values that our American nation, you know, is able to be founded on. I'd like to open up the floor. I have a couple of questions already, but I'd like to open up to the floor. I know there's Trish and perhaps Ty or someone have questions for Susie. Yeah, go ahead, Trish.
I guess my first question, Gloria, is how did we get so lucky to have her on this call today? So hats off to you for organizing this, and thank you so much, General, for being here. I think myself, like many other people, you know, when we have the chance to learn about different cultures, a lot of it can come through kind of popular media or other things of that nature. So, you know, I think of a lot of different things like Hawaii 5.0 from my childhood, and just like so many different, you know, data points about what the Asian Pacific Islander community is like. So maybe I'll ask this: what do you think, like in popular culture, really gets something right that reflects a little bit about the Asian and Pacific Islands? And what is one thing that you think, you know, if you could just like remove it from popular culture and throw it on the trash heap of history, you would get rid of, in terms of how we are able to kind of understand the culture from afar?
Well, thank you, Trish. Thank you. How did I get so lucky to talk to all of you? Really should be the question, right? And thank you for what you do, and all of you. That's a great question, Trish, because, you know, when I went to basic training, by the way, because I'm half Japanese, so I look Asian, right? And I went to basic training in Fort Dix, New Jersey in 1986. I went alone, and there were no other Asian or Pacific Islanders. So this is a sampling from across the country. So I had people from inner city, Bronx, to remote areas in Alabama. And so some of them would say, you remind me of Bruce Lee, because that's the only movies, you know, were coming in the 70s that they saw of Asian, right? So it's like an Asian spotting, right, on TV. Oh, wow. But we see a lot more today. And we see Disney cartoons, right? So you look at Moana, that's actually an interesting meshing of all of Polynesia, right? So those of you from Hawaii know that that's not actually Hawaiian. They took Tongan, Samoan, they took a lot of it and created this Polynesia. But I thought it was actually pretty good about ancestors and respect for land and place. I think they did a fairly good job, but it does mesh together all of the cultures in there. Crazy Rich Asians was the first time you had an all Asian cast. You know, coming from Hawaii, my experience is a little different there, but I think, you know, it showed one, I guess, more the continent experience of Asians rather than Hawaii. So it kind of helped me visualize those kinds of relationships and those cultures. I felt like Joy Luck Club was a wonderful example of connecting, you know, parents, because I think that Joy Luck Club, while it was Chinese American, I think transcends all immigrant stories, and not just Asian American. I mean, Pacific Island. I think all immigrants have that, whether you're from Europe or elsewhere, because it's that connection. I feel like those kind of movies speak to everyone. And I think the more that they can speak to everyone, and everyone can connect and not just look at what they look like, it's the humanity, the common humanity we have with the elements of culture. You know, like, I think about, I'm not Greek, but I love you know, big fat Greek wedding, because I'm sure that for some people who are Greek or Italian stories, but I think the more we can do that and see the commonness and pick out like, oh yeah, I can relate to that, is the more we're going to be unified. So that's a long answer, Trish, to a question, but thank you for that question. That was a great question. I'm going to think about that more, that you put it in my head.
Any other questions before I answer? I have a question too, Susie. With all of the, with your experience when back in basic training, and then being able to undergo a lot of you had a lot of first times. What inspired you the most thinking about that journey, and then being able to overcome some of the self-doubt as you were the first time woman, the first time Asian American, the first time Hawaiian? What were some of the things that you were able to apply in your journey to where you are today, and that you can think back and tell yourself, yeah, that was definitely something that if I didn't have growing up, I wouldn't have been able to go through it and conquer through that?
Thanks, Gloria. I think, all of us, humanity is refined by fire, right? So like gold is refined by fire. We're all refined by challenges. So growing up in the lower economic sphere, and, the kind of family that you knew it was when it was payday, when you didn't have enough, I think actually helped, because you were going to try hard, and even if you failed, you dust off and you get back up and keep going. So having, those experiences that we all have that develop grit, or lack of fear. So when you fail, not being afraid to try again, I think those experiences that many of us, I'm sure on here, or you wouldn't be here, have your own stories to tell about grit. But I think that's a common thing we all can share, is not having, so I grew up in that time too, where you have the reruns of Leave It to Beaver, right? And it was the ideal home, American home, and we didn't look like that, nor did in Hawaii did we grow up with mom with pearls. And I don't think I'm maybe one of you might have, but I think the vast majority of us was not like that, no matter what kind of ethnic household you came from. But to Trish's point, media has a lot of influence on us, but the realities were different. But what I found in organizations like, being in the military, and organizations like your own, we, I think, lead and champion the way of integration. And so did the military, by the way. When they were separate units during World War II, well before, so Korean War, you saw an integrated unit, well before the rest of the United States, the military was. I think the military has spearheaded a lot of that type of integration in the defense industry. So that is a plus.
We have a question in the chat from David. For both Susie and myself, what are important things to understand about Hawaii and the rest of the island chain near when it comes to emerging ventures, startups, and academia in that region? And then culturally, how are things different there? Not necessarily talking about the regional military cultures, although that's interesting too. So that's just a question from David.
That's a great question. So, one of the things I was doing as part of the Hawaii Chamber of Commerce and the Military Affairs Council, but, wanting to diversify Hawaii's economy outside of tourism, because tourism, so we went from a plantation industry, heavy sugar cane and pineapple, to tourism. So I saw that transition. But some feel now after COVID that we have unsustainable tourism. So there is a huge desire for startups, diversifying agriculture, diversifying more eco-tourism, more high-tech STEM, we see the need with defense investments in smaller, having local startups that happen here that provide more high-end employment. And so that means, of course, the K through 12 and post-secondary training has to be integrated as well. But I think I see folks coming in because they know this. When we talk about the billions of dollars of US DoD investment in the region and the opportunities for other smaller businesses in the tech industry, so lots are coming in from the mainland. But it's understanding that you have to build relationships. You have to understand the host culture. You cannot just plop down. So one of the things I did was a Homeland Defense Radar Hawaii. So if you remember that, so I was working with Senator Hirono, a lot of the missile defense. The initial assessment of locations for that radar, and this applies to businesses, right? When we think about place, were 40 locations, and it narrowed down to 3. One of them was on Kua'okala Ridge, which is Kaena Point, which in Hawaiian culture is a dropping off point, very sacred in where your soul and spirit goes to after you die, and it's on there, and they would have to shave off part of that mountain. Now, I shared, coming from that perspective, understanding the cultural sensitivity and history before you plop down is important. So eventually, a lot of money was spent on doing research and assessment on a place that was going to be a non-starter from the beginning. So understanding, using the cultural understanding before you make a decision on where to plop down, do an assessment like you do. I think what you do anyway is doing that assessment of the operating environment that you're in is the same with cultural environment here in Hawaii. That place, water, land are critical to Native Hawaiians, and how you preserve and protect the language and culture is critically important. So starting a business, you have to be very much aware of that.
And I imagine too that would also apply across the Pacific as well, right? Like in other countries. Yeah, that's definitely one of the things that I think would be absolutely valuable. Any other questions before I ask my next question? Sorry, just want to make sure we have everyone else. And please feel free to also share your story. As Susie had said earlier, this is also about talking story, what we say here on the island.
I saw Trish shared that story about her roommate was Samoan and her mom,
It was hysterical.
her taxes, and she got off the phone, girl.
Yeah, they were speaking primarily Samoan, and then they kind of switched over to the portion about taxes, and they were speaking in English. So she got off the phone. I was like, oh, look at that. I picked up Samoan just by living with you. It's so funny.
That is funny. I love it.
Hey, Susie, I have a question. As a person of Asia Pacific, and this is a question that we also asked some of our students who are interested in the DoD space but have not been exposed to it here at UH Manoa, being from Asia Pacific background. And I'm curious to see what your response is as a person of Asia Pacific descent. How is the national security community different for you? And you had mentioned several examples growing up and today. Are those experiences different? Do you still see the same the similarities, or how is the national security community different for you being Asia Pacific background?
I think the national security community, because I had a lot of examples from World War II, I think of working through it, and yet having that upholding those values of duty, honor, loyalty to country, that I always held on to. Like I said, I knew the stories of the 10442, and yet today I see a lot of younger people who don't know. And General Flynn, by the way, at the Memorial Day service mentioned the 10442 yesterday, the most highly decorated unit of its size to this day in the United States Army. And it's those kinds of stories that I think those of us who are from this region know, but not enough know. I think we could all get inspired by that. I think the national security, environment and organizations are committed to mission. And I think that's what binds us together is mission, and that we know we have to do everything and garner all of the talent that's available to accomplish mission. And sometimes that's having to convince other organizations. We hear the dialogue now in other organizations outside of defense industry. But I think it has to be a continual dialogue, because we can easily forget and fall back into those slumps of the past where we don't have that kind of diversity in our dialogue and diversity in our thinking. And then we end up being stuck. And those that are most innovative have, again, the cultures of let's bring it on. And you don't have to look like me. You don't have to be like me. I know it's been said, you heard when, the whole George Floyd incident occurred, and there's a lot of conversation in our nation about, discrimination and unconscious bias that occurs. And I think it still does occur, that unconscious bias. And now we're having disinformation that's in our information space that polarizes people even more. I think we in this community have an opportunity to shine a light on those efforts to disunify us, that we have a responsibility to do that and show that we are more common than not, and also acknowledge the unconscious bias and blatant discrimination that happens in communities, and be able to rise up above that together. That these issues are not just an Asian American issue, or Black American issue, or Hispanic American issue, or women's issue. This is our issue. This is our human American issue, and we need to keep. And I think no better community than the national security community to lead the way, as we always have.
Thank you. That's awesome. And with the little time that we have left, I wanted to first send out any other last questions. Okay, I'm going to do the mandatory 6 seconds. Susie, any last comments? Just as a segue from what you had just mentioned, really like within a couple of seconds ago, any last comments, a legacy perhaps you'd like to leave after, your entire career that you've had, and, future generations, and being able to continue that dialogue that you'd like to perhaps give to us, the National Security Innovation Network team here and the family here that we have, and moving forward into the coming year.
First, I want to say thank you, Gloria. Thank you, all of you, for what you do. Quietly behind the scenes, that the work you do is critically important. And that I hope that you are never defined by your circumstances. That diversity is, of course, things that we're inherently born with, but yet also what we experience. And and it's not just ethnicity, gender, religion, but it's also age, that we can learn much from those who are older. And not because I'm older, I'm saying that, but we can also learn from younger. We can learn from people from every part of this nation, from a small town to a big city, to broken homes, to different socioeconomic classes. That we got to remember that we are each as individual as our fingerprint and our bio eye scan. If we are that individually different, that inside in the core, we need to remember that we come also bringing those experiences. But then leaders need to have the understanding that you have to create the environment and culture so that all those experiences and perspectives can be realized for innovation if we want to advance. And we can't be stuck in the past. We got to move forward toward the future. And the last thing is that, you know, we've heard it said ducks pick ducks, but what if we pick ducks of the variety of feathers? What if we pick ducks based on values and not what we see on the outside? That we look in the heart about the passion and commitment and care from one another, where we would have a different place. And I believe you all are starting to move it in that direction by having these dialogues. So thank you so much for what you do.
Thank you so much, General Vares-Lum. This is such a rewarding and wonderful morning that I had this morning here in Hawaii. Still yet. Thank you everyone who's been able to join us. And I hope that this has been a meaningful time. It definitely has been for me to be able to listen and to hear how we can move forward with the diversity mission that we have here at NSIN, as well as within our community. I'd also like to remind everyone to watch out for information about our June 16 Pride Month speaker, Luke Schlausner, who is the co-founder of Out in National Security. Please look out for that. But then, without further ado, thank you so much, Major General Vares-Lum, for joining us today. God bless you, and I hope you have a blessed rest of the week.
Thank you so much, Gloria. Aloha to all of you.
Aloha.